Obduction is a science fiction adventure from Cyan, the makers of that old 90s game Immersed. It's had VR support for a while now, but it's also notoriously demanding on PC hardware, so I wanted to try it on a PC with an RTX 3080 and a Ryzen 5 5600X CPU to see how it runs. So let's take a look.
Immersed Robot.
Hello everyone, welcome to Immersed Robot. So in this video I wanted to take a look at Obduction, a puzzling game by Cyan, and I wanted just to see how it runs at various settings really on my PC. So when I first went in, I decided to start with the baseline as I usually do of Steam VR super sampling at 100% and then 90Hz in the Valve Index. And I also went into the graphics options and set it on the preset, the quality preset of medium, while also ramping the resolution scale in-game all the way up to 200%. And the reason I wanted to do this immediately is when I very briefly went into the game before I recorded this video, I did notice quite a lot of blurring, so I wanted to keep the Steam VR settings pretty much at their base level and then ramp up the super sampling within game just to see if that helped out. And on those settings, on medium settings, it was still a very blurry game actually, and this was a little bit disappointing to me when I first went in, but I decided to carry on anyway. And in this opening section I just wandered around for a while just trying to see how the game looked, and you can see when you look into the distance you can see this blurring effect over everything. It is an Unreal Engine game, and I know there used to be an issue with deferred rendering in those Unreal games, but they do have the forward renderer in there now, and I don't know if this game uses the deferred rendering or the forward renderer, but it has those artifacts, that blurring anti-aliasing effect that those deferred rendering games did have. And it was again a little bit disappointing when I first went in, but you can see from the frame rate and the frame timings that everything is running really well, so it wasn't quite as demanding as I was expecting, considering I was running the game at those 200% super sampling in game. But then it did occur to me that perhaps because it does say you may need to restart in order for that in-game super sampling to take effect, that perhaps it hadn't taken effect. So I was actually probably running closer to 150% super sampling in game with these effects, but we can still get an idea in the early stages of the game just exactly how well it's running with those anyway. And here I did ramp the quality preset up to high settings and I applied that, still running at that 150% in-game super sampling, and once things had settled down it still ran perfectly fine at those 90 FPS on these settings. There were drops here and there, and it seemed to be that when it was loading in new things, new scenery, or there was voiceover or a new effect or something like that, so it tended to be, or it seemed to be more around when it was loading in new assets really. But on the whole, I was surprised it was still running really great on those high graphical settings as well. I then tried the Epic quality preset and resumed the game, still in this opening section, and at this point it was dropping down into reprojection. It couldn't maintain 90 in most areas, although as I wandered around I did notice it did manage to sustain it for certain periods of time. I turned off motion smoothing in order to just give an accurate representation of exactly how the frame rate was overall, and it's sort of fluctuating quite a lot here in this section as well. And again you can see that in place it does sort of maintain 90, but on the whole it wasn't running great, and without motion smoothing it was a very juddery experience really. But then I did notice that it is dependent on the exact area that you are in, so a little bit later on as I was wandering around this opening section still, I did notice it go up and sustain 90 FPS for extended periods of time, but I wasn't too sure if I wanted to play on this, knowing that just around another corner it could drop down again and become a little bit more stuttery, so I decided to drop things back down at that stage. So I went back to high settings and then went to the anti-aliasing options just to see if I could turn anti-aliasing off in order to give a sharper image, but it wasn't possible. You can switch it over to low, and I tried Epic, but both of these settings were really a little bit blurry. Epic was better, but it was still blurry overall to me. So maintaining these settings, I went into the next area. This is the first part of the proper game once it opens out a little bit, and you can see it running great, still on high settings, still on those previous settings that I had in that opening area, and it was looking good on these sections where objects are close to you, but then when you get out into the opening and you can see further into the distance, then you do notice that blurring quite heavily, especially when you see something like a sign in the middle distance and the text itself is just completely illegible. You can't read it at all really, and that's where you notice this blurring more than ever. So I did try to change SteamVR super sampling in game and it didn't have any effect, so it obviously required a restart, and at that point I did come out of the game and go back in. And when I came back into the game, I had set SteamVR super sampling on 200%, still running at those 90Hz in the index, but as well as that, I think it had also applied the 200% in-game super sampling. And when I went back in, it was stunning. I mean, it looked so sharp, so clear, everything looked fantastic at these settings, as you probably would expect at that level of super sampling. But the downside, of course, you can see that I was running in some places at reprojection, half frame rate, 45 FPS rather than the native 90 frames per second. So for the next few minutes I basically just tried a few different in-game settings in order to maintain this level of clarity or closer to it, while also changing some of the settings to sort of give me slightly better frame rate. And I tried a number of the presets. I went between low, medium, high, and I was able to get it running smoothly again, but then I'd noticed that although it wasn't really blurry, there were issues with the anti-aliasing and there were a lot of jaggies in the distance, and in various settings it was really bad, really bad sort of pixel crawl in the distance. So I changed things around a lot more, and once I had just gone back up to the preset of high, then everything was clear again. So I sort of maintained that, and for the most part during that time I was able to maintain 90 FPS in this section. Now I'm very early on in the game, as you can see, so this is just a test of this first part of the game. I don't know how much it will change in terms of performances I go through, but I was getting relatively consistent performance in this area, but there were drops in certain areas, and it seemed to be when it was loading in new assets, as I mentioned before, that seemed to be where you got these drops, and sometimes they could be quite bad, although I will say that overall the performance was relatively consistent within this opening area. The image quality was great, it wasn't blurry, and also it wasn't too heavy on the jaggies either. It wasn't too heavy on that pixel crawl effect that you get where you've not got too much anti-aliasing. So there was anti-aliasing, and the image quality to me looked fantastic while also maintaining some level of performance. But that's pretty much it for this video. Just wanted to give you an idea of how this game runs on an RTX 3080, and you can get some idea of it in this opening section at least, so I hope it proved to be valuable to some people. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Please consider supporting Immersed Robot on Patreon, or joining the Discord, or following me on Twitter, or better yet, all of the above. Links in the description below.